took an oath of office, and so did everybody in Congress. And that oath of office is to follow the Constitution of the United States of America. No one is above the law, not even the President of the United States.
No surprise that Elizabeth Warren is backing House Democrats. They're moving ahead with an impeachment inquiry. What is a surprise is how fast the whole process is going. I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times. Welcome to the New York Times Close Up. We'll talk impeachment politics in a minute. Also on tap, the Times' Brian Rosenthal will talk about the next installment in his extraordinary reporting on struggling taxi drivers. Some have been driven to bankruptcy or even suicide because of predatory lenders. And Martin Scorsese is back with another epic film, a gangster film called The Irishman. This one about Jimmy Hoffa and stars Oscar winners Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, Joe Pesci. We'll be joined by Times chief film critic Tony Scott with a preview of that movie and the rest of the fall film season. But we begin with the impeachment drama in Washington. It seems like more has happened in the last 2 weeks than in the 2 years of the Mueller investigation. Rudy Giuliani, Secretary of State Pompeo, subpoenaed for documents. The White House threatened with a subpoena too. But in the midst of all this, the Democratic primary battle continues. How is the impeachment inquiry affecting the candidates and the race? And will all the attention about debunked corruption allegations regarding Ukraine hurt Joe Biden? Plenty to talk about with Johanna Barr, senior politics editor at the Times, and Clyde Haberman, a contributing writer. It's hard to keep up, and we are talking Thursday afternoon, so God knows what's going to happen next. But now we have today the president appealing to China to step into the Biden inquiry, Joe Biden and his son. If asking Ukraine to investigate the Bidens, how can he justify now asking China to investigate?
Well, it's pretty.
This is almost a rhetorical question.
It's pretty remarkable. It was right on television, right outside the White House. There's no denying that that is what he said. You know, it's unclear if he thinks that doing it again and again will make it less of a problem, but that was the choice that he made, and we'll see what happens and whether or not Republicans try to hold him responsible for it.
What could be the rationale? Is he just going to go down a list of countries and say, well, it doesn't matter that I did it for Ukraine, I'm doing it for everyone else?
It's the wrong question, if I may, about rationale. There's nothing rational about this guy. He's a counterpuncher constantly, and so he will probably go down the whole list of whatever 190 UN members. I'm waiting for him to get to Mauritania. It's outrageous, and even more outrageous is, for me, and I'm sure many millions of people, is the complicit behavior of Republicans in this. They have to know that this is unacceptable behavior from a president.
Is it unacceptable or impeachable?
Well, that's to be decided, of course. To me, it's impeachable. I think telling a foreign leader, you want your money from us, I want you to investigate the Bidens, there's no other way to interpret that transcript. That the White House itself released, and that was to some degree perhaps redacted, so there might even be worse in there for all any of us know. That's an impeachable offense, yes. Now, whether it's going to lead to a conviction, that would be extremely doubtful, I think. But I think the Republicans have basically sold their souls to a very unreliable devil. And with luck, I'm allowed to say it in my ex officio capacity now, they'll pay a serious price for it.
Johanna, what is the impact of all of this on Joe Biden? It links him to an investigation, which can't be helpful. It also makes him a target of President Trump, which arguably singles him out among the Democratic candidates. Is this a plus or minus at this point?
Well, with the caveat that it's still very early and lots can change. You know, as you pointed out, it's debunked. There's no proof that he did anything wrong, but it's raising the specter of corruption, you know, in the air, that there is an issue here. And the central argument of Joe Biden's candidacy has been that I don't like the word electable, but that he's the one best equipped to beat Trump, you know, and there are voters in swing districts who have overlooked maybe some of his gaffes or some of the bits of his record that, you know, some may find objectionable because they think, again, he's the most equipped to beat Trump. And something like this is the kind of thing, you know, that could potentially poke holes in that narrative. And, you know, there are 19 Democratic candidates. It's not a two-person race just yet between Trump and Biden. And not that all 19 of those don't have a chance, but there are certainly a few people there in the wings waiting to capitalize.
Yeah, I think Elizabeth Warren came out ahead of these recent days, first with the Biden inquiry and with Bernie Sanders' stents that were put into deal with clogged arteries, reinforcing he's 78 years old now. You know, stents probably do wonders, and I'm sure his blood flow is probably better than mine right now, but it just reinforces, God, is he too old for this job? And Biden's not much far behind in age. Not that Elizabeth Warren is exactly a teenager, and she's 70 herself. So
that used to be old.
It used to be old. I certainly look on it as now as middle age. But no, kidding aside, she's a very vigorous 70-year-old. And I would think she came out ahead of these last few days.
The president and the White House have held all sorts of things from Congress. Why is withholding what's being asked for in this inquiry from Jerry Nadler, from Adam Schiff, from others in Congress? Why is this being regarded as obstruction of justice, possibly an impeachable offense?
I mean, to me, it's cascading. It's everything on top of each other, you know, and it seems like there's an opening here, and like you said earlier, I mean, this is pretty clearly, you know, textbook impeachable offense, some might argue, and so they see an opening and they're taking it.
One of the things that is hard to figure out with the president is understanding his language. He talked about the Bidens the other day, and he said, nobody has any doubt that they weren't crooked. Tough to parse that when it's sort of a triple negative. He also, in a tweet, said that the do-nothing Democrats should be focused on building up our country, not wasting everyone's time and energy on bullshit, he said. Now, how do we decide whether to print or online or in the paper a profanity like that? It's sort of like something Pat Moynihan said about defining deviancy down. Are we stooping to his level?
Well, I would argue no. I was surprised, frankly, that the word you just used was not in the Times, at least not in the print edition that I was reading, whereas much more graphic and you know, dirtier words, most people would say, have been printed.
And not from the president.
And certainly not from the president. It's come up a few times in the last few years. We've had occasion to run the F word in its entirety. So not using bullshit.
The B word.
Was odd. But worse, this is coming from the president, for God's sakes, and it is just offensive on so many levels that I can't even begin to describe it. It's, you know, this has been said by a lot of people, the projection factor in this thing. Trump hurls at other people that which he and his family themselves are guilty of. The Bidens taking money, first of all, there's no evidence of anything against Joe Biden, but Trump's children have been grabbing the benefits of this presidency with both fists, and they've been exploiting their father's political success mercilessly and shamelessly.
Thanks to Johanna Barr, Clyde Haberman of the New York Times. And coming up next, a major investigation by the Times revealed how predatory lenders drove taxi drivers to financial ruin and even suicide. We'll have new developments in a minute from Brian Rosenthal. Brian Rosenthal of the New York Times conducted a year-long investigation into the taxi industry. What it found was disturbing. Unscrupulous predatory lenders drove medallion prices to $1 million or more. Then they trapped drivers into loans they couldn't afford. Many drivers were financially ruined. Some committed suicide. All the while, New York City officials did nothing. But the Times probe got state and city officials to act. Brian is here with the latest chapter in his investigation. Brian, bring us up to date on what the reaction has been to the series so far.
So there's been a lot of reaction at pretty much every level of government. There have been some investigations that have started. The Attorney General of New York is investigating. The federal prosecutors in Manhattan are investigating. The mayor already conducted an investigation. There's already been one arrest of a debt collector in the industry. There have been some laws that have been proposed to crack down on these types of practices in the future. The city has waived some fees owed by the medallion owners and set up some driver assistance centers for the drivers that are in this situation. And the biggest thing right now is the discussion about a potential bailout for the people in this situation, and those conversations are ongoing right now.
As you've reported, most of the things that have been done look to the future, making sure that these things don't happen again. But what about a bailout? The city says, look, everybody struggles in New York, but here's a case where the rules were changed in the middle of the game. There was a cap on the number of medallions. Suddenly, Lyft and Uber and other services come in. Now, critics will say, quoting either Barnum or W.C. Fields, you can't cheat an honest man. And, people who are going into this business maybe ask for it or close one eye. But don't the drivers deserve some kind of break here?
Well, and the other aspect of this is that the city made a lot of money. Over the course of this period, this 12 years in which the bubble took place in New York, the city made more than $855 million.
This on selling medallions?
Correct. Mm-hmm. And collecting taxes on sales that were happening privately. And so there are a lot of people that are saying, even if this costs hundreds of millions of dollars, it's actually not a cost to the city because the city has already banked the money, and this is just dealing with the repercussions of that. So it's something that is, again, being discussed. The city council has convened a task force, and they are really looking into this. There are other people that are not as sure about it, including the mayor, but we're going to see how it all shakes out.
Now, your latest story in this series says that they did such a good job of messing this up in New York that they exported the system all over the country.
Yeah, that's what we found in this new story that we're publishing, and it's really about the exportation of this business model. There aren't that many cities in America that have medallion systems, but if you look at the ones that do, almost all of them in this period got visited by New York lenders and brokers and fleet owners, and these practices started to appear. And the city that we focus on in our story is Chicago. It's the second biggest taxi industry in the United States, and it was a real target for these New York taxi industry leaders who came over and put their business model into effect there.
And did it work as well or as badly in Chicago as it did here?
Well, there are a lot of similarities between what happened. One thing that's different is that the prices didn't get quite as high. In Chicago, they went up to nearly $400,000, which is obviously a far cry from $1 million, but it's still a lot of money for a permit to be able to own a cab. And so, basically what happened in Chicago was very similar to New York, but just not on as quite as big a scale.
And the more you look at this, as you delve deeper into it, do we have a better sense of who is to blame for all of this? Was everyone simply looking the other way and pocketing the money?
Yeah, I think there are different levels of blame and different ways in which you could assign blame. I think the overarching point that we have tried to make in our stories is that this is a situation where the increasing price of this asset, this taxi medallion, which was skyrocketing in value. That increase was good for everybody. It was good for the city. They were making all kinds of money. It was good for people that own medallions, obviously, fleets. It was good for lenders who were lending money. It was even good for the drivers until it wasn't. And at the end of the day, the people who were left kind of holding the bag when this bubble burst were the owner-drivers who really suffered the consequences.
Brian Rosenthal, thanks for that series, and we look forward to others coming up. Coming up next, Oscar winner Meryl Streep stars in a new movie about the Panama Papers called The Laundromat. Another Oscar winner, Renee Zellweger, plays the legendary Judy Garland in a biopic. The Times' A.O. Scott previews the fall movie season next.
Only 3 people in the world have one of these. And only one of them is Irish.
I heard you paint houses.
No, please. No, please. Martin Scorsese directing Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, and Joe Pesci in a 3.5-hour gangster movie about Jimmy Hoffa sounds like an offering you can't refuse. Joker, starring Joaquin Phoenix, is a mentally ill, failed comedian, stirring up all kinds of controversy and fears even before it opens this week. Angelina Jolie returns in Maleficent, Mistress of Evil, a dark fantasy adventure from Disney. It opens later this month. Not to mention Star Wars, The Rise of Skywalker, the 9th and supposedly final episode of the Skywalker saga. Looks to be a surefire blockbuster. The Times' chief movie critic, A.O. Scott, is a busy guy this time of year. Now, Tony, you pointed out in writing about The Irishman that it opens with a mirror image, if you will, of what you call the all-time canonical moment in American cinema, the Copa shot from Goodfellas. What is the Copa shot, and why is this the mirror image?
It's one of the great shots, and I think it shows what an amazing filmmaker Martin Scorsese is, that people will know what I'm talking about as soon as I describe it. It's when Henry Hill, who's played by Ray Liotta, and his girlfriend Karen are coming into the nightclub, into the Copacabana nightclub, and the camera follows them in a single unbroken take as they go from the car through the sidewalk, down through the kitchen, out to their table, and they sort of arrive on the scene. And what that shot is doing is showing Henry Hill's arrival into this world of the mafia that is kind of success beyond his wildest dream. He's a I don't know if he's technically at this point yet a made guy, but he's arrived. He's there. The first shot of The Irishman uses the same technique. You're going down a corridor, the camera's kind of looking this way, that way, but you're in a nursing home. You see, people with IV drips. You see doctors, nurses, nuns. It's a Catholic nursing home, and you get to the end of the corner, and you sort of turn the corner, and there's an old guy sitting in a wheelchair, and it's Robert De Niro, a mobster who's come to the end of his string. And what The Irishman is about, if Goodfellas is about kind of the romance and excitement and ambition and energy of being in the world of organized crime, what The Irishman is really about is a kind of sense of waste and futility and regret, and how even the memories, even the stories that you have to tell are just going to fade away and nobody's going to care about them. And so it's often a very exciting, very funny movie in the way that Goodfellas is, but it also has this really, the main note that you feel is this kind of melancholy, this just sort of sadness that makes it, I think, really beautiful and poignant.
And you were saying that 3.5 hours is not too long to feel sad.
No, because it's this kind of thing where there's an old guy telling stories. It's Robert De Niro's character, Frank Sheeran, the Irishman of the title, who's involved with Jimmy Hoffa, who's played by Al Pacino, who's also involved by Russell Bufalino, who's a Pennsylvania mobster played by Joe Pesci. And it's kind of a story of the complicated friendship and rivalry among these three guys, but it's also retelling the whole story of organized crime from the late 40s, you know, up mostly through the 70s. So it's the rise and fall of Jimmy Hoffa. And it touches on all of this other stuff, the Bay of Pigs, the Kennedy assassination, Watergate, everything, you know, the mob is showing up, as you know, I don't have to tell you, on every page of American history. But what keeps it going, and what makes it, I think, something new, because I was sort of going into this movie with a little bit of skepticism, thinking, you know, Scorsese's been here before, he's done this before, is this just going to be him kind of rehashing what he knows and does best and what his fans like most? But it just finds new dimensions and new emotions in the story, and the performances are just, I mean, you know, these are not bad actors, and they're really, all of them kind of just at the top of their games.
What's the controversy over the Joker?
The Joker, so it debuted at the Venice Film Festival, and a lot of people really liked it. It won the top prize there. And as sometimes happens with movies that seem to resonate with something in the public world, people were getting nervous that is it going to inspire mass shootings? Does the violence, which it's a violent movie, but there are plenty of violent movies. The Irishman is a really violent movie. Is the sort of the violence and nihilism going to inspire people to do bad things? My feeling about that is that the people are going to do the bad things who are going to do the bad things, and you can't put that on a movie. All of that said, it's a terrible movie. It's just not. I have trouble seeing.
And that's the best thing you could say about it.
I mean, it's just not to quote my own review, but if you're going to argue about a movie, it should at least be an interesting movie. And the Joker, it's a kind of a mishmash of cliches and attitude. It tries to be very kind of dark and grim and serious. It rips off Martin Scorsese, speaking of Martin Scorsese, left, right, and center. De Niro is in it playing a character not unlike the Jerry Lewis character from King of Comedy, but it all adds up to very little. I mean, it's not a movie. It thinks it's a movie about nihilism, but it's just really a movie about nothing.
There are also sort of a bunch of, I guess you could call them biopics in a way. Meryl Streep in The Laundromat, Berlusconi, Roy Cohn. Why is
Judy
that?
Garland.
Judy Garland, of course.
Well, not in all of those cases. I mean, Roy Cohn is a biography, and you're in it, by the way. Maybe you'll get nominated for an Oscar, I don't know. But it has to do with that. I mean, actors like to win Oscars, and the way that you often win Oscars or get yourself into the Oscar discussion is by impersonating a famous, real person. And it can be a lot of fun to watch, and audiences like it. And you know, last year we had Rami Malek in Bohemian Rhapsody. Earlier this year, we had the Elton John biopic. Renee Zellweger playing Judy Garland. You know, it's how can you pass that up? That's a big, juicy performance. Later this season, you'll have Tom Hanks as Fred Rogers. So it's what actors like to do.
Sounds great. Sounds like a good season. Thanks to A.O. Scott, and I'll add my thoughts on Coda next. Not long after Donald Trump became president, when he and Vladimir Putin were being described as fellow travelers, Trump lamented that he lacked a guardian angel. Where, he demanded, is my Roy Cohn? Let's assume the irony of invoking one of the most savage red baiters of the 1950s was lost on Trump. His lament, echoed in the title of a new documentary film, was Who's Defending Donald Trump, especially while an independent counsel was probing any links between the president and Putin. Cohn died more than 3 decades ago, but his profile has surfaced like an old scar because Trump was his mentee. Cohn had a well-deserved reputation for what A.O. Scott of The Times called a passionate disdain for the truth. He was also regarded for his loyalty to legal clients. Since so many were organized crime figures, though, his devotion might have been less a professional virtue than a prudent means of avoiding an untimely death. As Trump circles the wagons around the White House, he ought to be worried, because Cohn came close to discovering that loyalty only goes so far. Buried in hundreds of pages of recently released FBI files is a revealing 1962 memo to Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. It reports that Las Vegas gamblers and casinos financed by mob-connected Teamster pension funds were also worried. They were, quote, greatly concerned over the extreme pressure being applied by the federal government on the Nevada gambling industry. To mitigate the pressure, according to that memo, the gamblers, quote, offered to trade Las Vegas for Roy Cohn. So much for honor among thieves. Imagine the memos just starting to circulate in self-defense about trading who knows what for Donald Trump. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.